Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is episode 630. I'm Seth Martin, your host. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here, and always happy you're listening. If you listened to the last show, you know we kind of introduced this guy, Yuri Bezmenov, and this was from the 80s, I think late 80s, that he gave this talk, and we were talking about communism, and we were talking about these what they call active measures, and I know that most of you listening, if not all of you, feel like today, especially post-COVID, that your government hates you, or we must hate ourselves. Like, if you want to look at America as a collective, the only way that we would be doing the things that we're doing is because we hate ourselves. I mean, this is kind of a theme that Tucker Carlson's been talking about. And the question is, how did we get here? How did this happen? How did we get to the point where it's okay on the floor of the United States Congress to talk about America as an evil empire and a colonial power and all this other kind of stuff? And why is that even relevant today? Why is it, if there's a relevant past in America, it's the past that includes the founding of America, the founding documents, the founding speeches, our founding fathers and what they said about freedom and liberty and what they said about tyranny and all these things. It's not that we had slaves for, 200 years before America was founded and 80 years after America was founded. That's not the important part of America, at least as far as I'm concerned. And focusing on that is not what made America great. It's not gonna be what makes America great again. Okay. And I think this is one of the reasons Donald Trump was probably elected, is he's not focused on these negative aspects of our country. Every country that ever existed has some negative aspects. We're going to talk about slavery in a few days, but slavery is not the cornerstone of America, of American greatness, okay? It's just not. If you believe that, then you have made a turn somewhere in the wrong direction. And there's a lot, you just need to recognize that you've been manipulated. You've been manipulated by the public schools. You've been manipulated by your university and your professors. You've been manipulated by the media and certain people in the government. You've just been manipulated into believing in some reality that's not a true reality. And of course, we looked at this the other day when we looked at Yuri Bezmenov. He talked about how this is done. About how there's this demoralization process, and then there's destabilization, right? Destabilization, and then there's a crisis, and then there's normalization, right? And so I think we just all need to recognize that we have been subjected to this ideology, this process that's led us to this place where we are in America. Remember, I always talk about problem solution. Like if you're going to work on a problem, you first have to identify the problem. And once you identify the problem, then you can start working on remedies to solve the problem, or a solution set to solve the problem. And this is part of this series that I'm doing, these 3 shows that I'm going to do. I'm kind of coming at it from that perspective, problem solution. So we spent the last show exposing you to Yuri Bezmenov, talking about what is happening, or what was happening to America, what the Cold War was all about, for Russia at least. For America, the Cold War was all about building nuclear weapons. For Russia, it was all about changing our mindset, changing the American mindset, because they knew they couldn't beat freedom. A free people can never be conquered by a bunch of slaves, which is what the Soviet Union was. And the people that ran the Soviet Union knew that. And so they set about trying to enslave Americans in America, which is really a pretty bold idea if you think about it, and a pretty bold move on their part. And how did they do this? Well, they found some useful idiots, okay, which we're surrounded by today. And I know that sounds arrogant, and I apologize if you're offended by that, but the bottom line is we just have a lot of people, and many of these people vote, that are useful idiots. In fact, one of them was murdered the other night, actually, him and his wife, Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner was a useful idiot, okay? Now, I love his movies. I think he was funny. I watched All in the Family a little bit. I was kind of on the edge of that. Brilliant director. I mean, When Harry Met Sally is a great movie. Just, there's no changing it. I mean, there's no arguing about it. When Harry Met Sally is a great movie. But Rob Reiner was a communist and a useful idiot. He's one of these guys, like a Bernie Sanders, who could not be convinced away from the direction of his worldview. And if the United States ever becomes communist or socialist, in other words, where the government really becomes, takes over the means of production and really starts to exercise its force in a way that puts us on a path of major decline, people like Rob Reiner and Bernie Sanders are going to be executed in the street. That's my prediction. Because at some point they'll realize they were wrong, and they'll be very vocal about it. And the government it's got no space for that. Totalitarian governments just kill people like that. But yeah, Rob Reiner, sadly, I mean, I am sad because I will never get to watch another great movie like When Harry Met Sally, because Rob Reiner is dead. But he is an example of this type of person, this type of person with a worldview that's gone through demoralization and given up on freedom, given up on liberty, given up on what made America great, unfortunately. So what you're looking at on the screen today, I'm going to pivot a little bit here. What you're looking at on the screen is a guy named Tom DiLorenzo. Tom DiLorenzo is retired now, but at the time, he was a professor of economics at Loyola University in Maryland. And I actually was at this Mises event back in 2015, and I remember taking notes while Tom DiLorenzo was talking. And I just thought this was a really good, I can't remember what the theme of this Mises event was, but what was good about Tom DiLorenzo's talk here, and I think that there's only just part of it here, was, where did this come from? How did this come about? Why do we think this way? Why are our universities full of people that think this way? And by the way, when I was in college, way back in the late 80s, I had a political science professor that I thought for sure, I mean, he just seemed like a communist to me. So this has been going on for a long time. And I distinctly remember thinking, I can't write what I really think in my papers with this guy because he'll just fail me. And we're gonna see some stuff tomorrow where this guy talks about this, and this is part of what they do. If you actually, universities are supposed to be these kind of incubators of thought, right? But what they've become is cultivators of a very specific type of thought. And the problem with that, just like the problem with all central planning, is the central planners could be wrong. And if they're wrong, what kind of calamity is likely to befall us? And that's where all this is leading. This is all leading to some sort of calamity that will enslave us even more so than we are today, will make our lives miserable, will lower our standard of living, will ultimately take our freedom and liberty. And, one day America will just cease to exist in the way we think about it. And so the question is, how is this happening? What happened? How did this happen? Who was behind it? And so Tom DiLorenzo is going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to break in from time to time. Probably won't play the whole thing just because it's long and makes the show that much longer when I play the whole thing. So, but I definitely want you to go out and listen to the whole thing. I'm going to put it in the show notes page. For all these shows, basically I put a link in the show notes page for you to go listen or watch the whole video that I use in these programs. Sorry about that. Wrong one.
You know, when with the worldwide collapse of socialism in the late 80s and early 90s, the Marxist left did not just throw in the towel. I remember at the time I was at the University of Tennessee, and there was a Marxist economist on the faculty, and I ran into him in the parking lot right in the middle of all this happening with Boris Yeltsin bombing the Russian parliament and things like that. And I said, John, what are you going to do now? Bricklayer? Carpenter? You know, what's the future for you? And he said, oh, no, we're stronger than ever now because we're no longer associated with all these bad guys, Ceausescu and Stalin and all that. And so after all this, the Marxist left took two different routes. You know, they didn't give up. One is they paid attention to the socialist economist Robert Heilbronner, who wrote an article in the New Yorker magazine in 1990, I think it was October 1990, in which he said, socialism, Mises was right. One of the articles he wrote was actually called, the title was Mises was right about socialism. And so you would think that meant give up on socialism, but no. He said we need to work harder at it. I mean, because it always was about totalitarian control. It never was about helping the poor, helping the laboring class, or anything like that. So it was always about control. And so how do we reassert our control over people's lives? He said, well, socialism was always sold in the name of helping the people. And he essentially said, people schmeeple, the hell with the people. We're for the bugs and the ants and the snakes and all that stuff, the planet. So let's sell socialism now in the name of saving the planet. And so hence the watermelons were born. The watermelons are green on the outside, red on the inside. And so there's a brand.
One of the things I think about, and Tom DiLorenzo is just a great speaker. He's kind of funny. He's got an interesting sense of humor. But how does someone like Tom DiLorenzo know? How did he know the Soviet Union would collapse? How did Ronald Reagan know that the Soviet Union would collapse? Listen to this story that he told about where he meets this communist guy that he used to work with in the parking lot. Hey, what are you going to do now? I mean, he wasn't surprised at all that communism collapsed. And what you'll find is if you look into this, and I think he references this at some point, Mises, way back in the, I don't know, man, maybe the 1910s or the 20s, wrote a book called Socialism, and he explained very specifically why socialism doesn't work, okay? Communism is just a more brutal form of socialism. And so he already knew it wouldn't work. Remember, the trailer for this show is, I talk about how the history of the world really, when you get right down to it, and I like to make things just simple, get right to the basics. What is the history of the world really about? What is America really about? And when you look at history, what you'll see is that the history of the world is about people that are free and those that want to rule over those that want to be free. That's it. It really is that simple. And America, the reason America was so great is it said that there is not going to be anybody that's going to rule. Okay? We're going to elect representatives, and they're going to do what the people say to do. Okay? This was what was so revolutionary about America. It wasn't that the Indians built some great land and we stole it from them, or, none of that. I'm not saying that doesn't matter. That's part of our history. Some of it's bad. Something like 90% of all Native Americans died from disease. And the Europeans that came over didn't know that they were bringing disease, okay? So all the Native Americans, that were killed basically died from disease. Something like only 10,000. I mean, I know you're not going to believe this because you've been told otherwise, but something like 10,000, only about 10,000 Native Americans were actually killed by the government or by other white people settling America. Only like 10,000. In fact, the native, there were many, many, many tribes in America. I mean, hundreds, thousands maybe. But these tribes were always warring with one another. And when the Europeans came, they actually kind of brought like this peace kind of arrangement. They essentially negotiated peace, or kind of fostered peace among all these different tribes. There wasn't actually conflict like we read about or we hear about, like Elizabeth Warren tells us that her ancestors, went through or whatever. She has high cheekbones, which makes her a Native American. Anyway, so there's just a lot of what what is it? Milton Friedman said, it's not what you don't know that's the problem. It's what you know that just ain't so. And that's the way a lot of history is. And a lot of what we know, or what we think we know about America. But the real genius of America was that we weren't going to have a ruler. Okay? We're going to be ruled by ourselves. We're going to be the rulers of ourselves. And there wasn't going to be a boss of me. Okay? And so this went against the narrative that basically marks the history of the world, which is there are people that want to be free. Freedom is not something you have to sell to people. Everybody wants to be free, okay? But there are people that are kind of narcissists, they're control freaks, there's something about their personality that has them desiring to rule over people. And so those are the two. That's the balancing act. That's what history is all about. When you read a history book, that's what it's all about. Yeah, there's political parties, and yes, there's factions, and there's this and there's that, but it's all really just about people that want to be free and people that want to rule over people that want to be free. But I one of the things that strikes me is about these Mises guys is a lot of them, even ones that are dead now, ones that never saw the Soviet Union collapse, they just knew it would collapse because it can't work. And there's a whole lot of technical reasons why it can't work. We're not going to go into it today, but it has to do with pricing. It has to do with prices and being able to price certain factors of production. And in a communist society or socialist society where the government actually owns the means of production, there's no way to do that. And that's what he's talking about here, how they made a shift. So they made a shift from kind of economic socialism, where the workers of the world unite and own the factors of production and roll out a world of equality. Okay, that was the original Marxist idea, to this new idea where we're gonna have what they call cultural Marxism, or we're gonna create a new enemy. The enemy is not capitalism per se. It's capitalism's war on the environment. And so we need to protect the environment, or we need to protect, this kind of the social Marxism is kind of where the woke stuff comes from, or the gender ideology narrative, or the whole intersectionality. If you're not familiar with some of these things, these are all Marxist ideas where there's like black people are oppressed, but fat black women are more oppressed. And so you have this, well, I'm oppressed. Well, I'm more oppressed. Well, I'm more oppressed. You have this never-ending battle to see who is the most oppressed. That's what intersectionality is all about. They're just crazy ideas. There's no way to make any sense of it. There's no way to kind of to govern a society based on this. You have to kind of look at everything in isolation. So when you're looking at, say, black people, you say, okay, black people were slaves. Those are the oppressed. And white people were the oppressors because they owned slaves. Okay, and then you move on to the next subject, and you just keep doing this until you have all these groups, and they're all oppressed by somebody. So somebody's the oppressor and somebody's the oppressed, and for an infinite number of different scenarios. And that's the cultural Marxism. So we went from economic Marxism to kind of this cultural Marxism. And what he's saying is this happened basically after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I'm going to put a link to the New Yorker magazine article that he just referenced here. I'm going to put that in the show notes page as well.
Of the Marxist left that all became environmentalists all of a sudden. And they're promoting basically centrally planned economies under socialism under the guise of saving the planet. The other branch became cultural Marxists. They gave up on the old class struggle between the working class and the capitalist class, and they invented some new classes. There's the oppressor class and the oppressed class. The oppressors are white heterosexual males, and the oppressed class is everybody else, pretty much. The whole victim thing. And so that's a good way to eliminate dissent and exert totalitarian control over society. And so we have those two classes. Now, I've been a university economics professor since 1979. I finished my PhD when I was 24, and I've been at it ever since. And for about the first 30 years of my career, every August, the university administration, and I've taught at 7 different universities, the university administration would send out a memo about what the average SAT score is of the incoming freshman. And they would usually brag that it's up 10 points or something like that. And it would usually be accompanied by a promise that we're going to increase the standards even more so that we'll have better qualified students. And of course, the faculty like this, to hear this. And that went on for about 30 years of my career, year in, year out, the bragging about how, the higher SAT scores. And then about 6 years ago, at my current employer, Loyola University, Maryland, they all of a sudden said, we're no longer requiring SAT scores at all as the entrance requirement. They did away with them. And the result of that, I noticed it's been successful because in the website, the university website this year, in August, instead of giving us any information about the academic qualifications of the incoming freshman class, it said, the incoming freshman class is the most diverse class in the history of the college. And so that's the objective. And so egalitarianism.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. Yeah, now let me just situate this timeline a little bit. This speech was in 2015, so he said about 6 years ago. So what does that tell you? That tells you 2009. Barack Obama came into office. And Barack Obama, and some of you may be Barack Obama fans, Barack Obama really damaged this country in a bad way. It was very secretively done. It was very covertly done. The reason it was like that, the reason it was hard to see what Obama was doing is because the media has always been on the left, okay, always, for as long as I've been alive anyway. And so you got this guy comes in, he's got this swagger. Remember they talked about his swagger and they talked about how charismatic he was and how smooth he moved around and all this kind of crap. All this is what they reported on. They didn't report on anything that he was doing. I always kind of talk about that. I always talk about how I don't care what people say. What I care is what they do. What they do is what can hurt you, not what they say. And what you see today is you see people worried about what what politicians are saying. They're all concerned about did you hear what Trump said? Oh my God. And I agree. He opens up his mouth and sticks his foot in it more often and more aggressively than anybody I've ever seen. It's just unbelievable, this guy. But what he's doing is not harming you. Unless you're an illegal and ICE is knocking at your door or something, If you're an American, there's nothing that Trump is doing that's really harming you, except for, I would say, the tariffs. The tariffs are harming you because it's making your stuff more expensive. But that's about it. I can't think of anything else that Trump is doing that's harming Americans. There's a lot of things he's doing that's harming illegals and people like that. But anyway, what Tom DiLorenzo is talking about here is the death of the meritocracy. When I grew up in America and I was going to college, like when I went to college, when I went to Texas A&M, at our student orientation, I don't remember how, there was thousands of people there. They said, look to your left and look to your right. Those people will not be here when you graduate. Now, let me just give you the numbers, okay? So every semester when I was at Texas A&M, and this is in the late 80s, every semester at Texas A&M, they would bring in 10,000 new freshmen every semester. But if you looked at how many students Texas A&M was graduating, it was only graduating about 3,500 students every semester. So where did the other 6,500 students go? Well, they quit or they failed out. That's the way they rolled back then. And it was just, they intentionally would try to fail you, especially in your freshman and sophomore years. You would routinely go to classes where they would put grade distributions on the board where there would be 0 A's, none, 0. Maybe a couple of B's, and the rest were a huge majority were C's and D's, and then there were a whole bunch of F's. And the reason they did that is because they needed to control how many people failed out, okay? Because Texas A&M is a state school. So if you're in a certain percentage level of your class, then the state of Texas says, Texas A&M, you must take that student. But as we know, all students are not created equal, right? I mean, if you can go to a really good school where it's very competitive, or you could go to some inner city school where it's just a total chaotic dump where most of the people can't even read. That's the problem with the public school system, is it's not fair to everybody that goes. I mean, these inner city schools are just horrible. These kids aren't learning anything. They haven't for years, for decades. When I was going to school, they weren't learning anything. So you got an entire generation now, maybe 2 generations, of people that haven't learned a thing, or they've learned the wrong thing. And then we wonder why, we have an H-1B visa program that we literally cannot survive. America cannot survive without a very progressive, active H-1B visa program because we just don't have the people with the level of knowledge that is required for like a modern economy. I mean, that is just the sad truth. And what Tom DiLorenzo is talking about here, it was all done intentionally. Why was it done? I don't know. I guess because free people are just too difficult to control. And so you've got to have more dummies. You got to have more stupid people. That's the only thing I can think of. All right, let's continue with Professor Dr. DiLorenzo here.
Has become the new secular religion in the academic seminaries where you send your children and grandchildren. And diversity, I think of the word diversity is basically some sort of quotas, is really, I call it the mating call of the academic administrators in today's world. When the cultural Marxists took over my university about 10 years ago, the new president came in and he started giving the president's message, started saying things like bemoaning the unequal distribution of resources around the world all of a sudden. And so, from each according to his ability to each according to his need is his motto. His name is Brian Lenane. And his academic vice president, who's the top academic officer of the university, when he had his first meeting with the business school faculty where I teach, he looked around the room and he said, there are too many people in here who look like me. Too many white guys, in other words. And the minority faculty were extremely uncomfortable about that. I was looking at my minority colleagues, and they were like didn't know where to hide. Because what he was basically saying was he was telling people like me, you don't really belong here because you're here because of white privilege. And also, he was telling the minority faculty, well, maybe you don't belong here either because you're here from affirmative action. You don't really belong there. I think that's why one of the reasons why they seem so uncomfortable. And then he announced that diversity would be his number one goal in his reign as academic vice president. So that's become the number one objective of a lot of universities. More than academics or learning, education, schmeducation is the attitude some of these people seem to have when they do that. That's why, I did call it the mating call of academic administrators in an article on LouRockwell.com referring to this guy. Tim Snyder is his name, Timothy Snyder, and he's no longer the academic vice president of my university.
This is kind of reminds me of something Tucker was talking about at the Charlie Kirk event, the TPUSA event in July that we covered. We've got these people that are kind of unimpressive that have elevated themselves somehow. How does this guy, this Timothy Snyder guy that he's talking about, how does he become academic vice president at a major university like this? The only explanation is that the rules, the administrative things changed in such a way that elevated this guy over other types of people. And that doesn't just happen. That's not organic, right? You don't go from a meritocracy to diversity is our strength just everywhere in the country organically. That just doesn't happen. There's no reason for that to happen. There's no mechanism for that to happen organically. Universities, as you know, without public funding for students, many of them are funded directly by the government, but certainly the students themselves get loans and things like that through the government, directly from the government. And these were just policies that were changed overnight. The Obama administration, had a Secretary of Education. Obama said, this is what I believe and this is what we're going to do. And they just quietly started changing things. And then one day you wake up and you got an academic vice president who's talking about diversity as our strength. Forget the meritocracy, forget academic freedom and diversity where we have diversity of thought. Forget those ideas. We're going to coddle people. We're going to teach people the new language of cultural Marxism. And that's how you're going to succeed. And so guys like Timothy Snyder said, well, this is the game I got to play. If I want to be academic vice president or I want to be provost of the university sometime, then this is the game I got to play. So they just changed the game in such a way that people's new incentives led to this place. That's how you do it. And this is central planning. This is what happens when you have this is what happens when instead of having a whole bunch of independent institutions responding to their thing, we have this top-down kind of command and control. This is the new narrative. This is the way we're going to do things kind of thing. And it wasn't, I don't know, maybe 20 episodes back, we talked about Mao and how Mao had this great idea to create co-ops for the farmers in China. And then fast forward a little bit, 5 million Chinese people die. Okay, this is the problem with top-down control. We don't see it right away. And some people, they just kind of, the incentives line up for them to do whatever it is they do to win. Right? Some people just want to win, right? They don't care what the game is. But if the game is cultural Marxism and it leads to a bad place, then you're winning at a game that elevates a level of stupidity or whatever. So anyway, this is kind of what's interesting again about this talk is this was back in 2015, and he's talking about how things changed about 6 years earlier. And this is somebody from inside the university system. And you can go find other people that talk about this. Tom DiLorenzo is not the only guy that was talking about this back then.
He's done his thing. And so silencing dissent is now praised and taught. It's taught to students and it's praised as the morally right thing to do. A lot of my students are totally unaware of the argument for free speech and academic freedom. And one person who's responsible for this, and this really starts I think in the
this silencing dissent. This is when Tucker always talks about it. He was like, "Shut up, racist!" These are methods and techniques used to silence dissent. Or what do you know? You're just a white male who's had all kinds of privilege in the patriarchy. These things are designed to make you feel ashamed of yourself, to make you feel like there's something wrong with your race, your gender, your sex even. And so these are things designed to control people, and they control you by silencing your dissent. Well, I don't agree. What was it we were playing a while back where, it was Tom Bilyeu when he said, in the problem with communism or socialism, however you want to call it, is eventually somebody's going to disagree. And how do you deal with that in a communist or socialist arrangement? Well, you silence the dissent. And these are kind of soft tyranny techniques. Racist, that's a soft tyranny. Or you just have white privilege. Or, whatever. I don't need to catalog all these techniques. But soft tyranny eventually leads to hard tyranny. What's hard tyranny? Bullet to the head. Executions on the street. It ends in force only accelerates. It doesn't get, you don't have an increase in force and then force levels out or something like that. No, force only increases because the number of people that begin to see increases. And so the force has to increase. And then at some point you can't stuff the genie back in the bottle. This is the problem with these types of systems. That's why individual liberty is the best. The most distributed power you can possibly arrive at is one person, one life, one decision. I decide for myself. That's the maximum amount of liberty. And maybe a step down from that is I decide for my family. That's maybe a lesser form of liberty. Or then lesser still would be we decide for my city that 75,000 of us live in. But every time you take the we decision to a greater number of people, that you're moving in the direction of tyranny. So maximum liberty is I decide for myself. I get to decide. That's one of the reasons the show is called Who Gets to Decide? Because who gets to decide tells you how much tyranny or how much liberty you have. And we saw this during COVID. Did you get to decide that you didn't want to take a shot? No. If you worked at an employer that had more than 100 employees, your employer was deciding for you. Ultimately, the decision was yours. You could quit and go find something else to do, but your employer was forcing that decision. And by the way, when he said that somebody stood up and said, the problem is too many people here look like me, that's actually happened to me before at a company. The name of the company will remain, I'm not going to say what company it was, but that actually happened to me at a company where somebody in the leadership stood up and said something like that. And that is very uncomfortable. I mean, you're like, what? All of a sudden you feel like you have a target on your back. So that's a real thing. That really does happen. All right, let's continue.
60s, as a lot of bad things started in the 60s. And there's an academic who's described on the web variously as the evangelist of cultural Marxism. He's also called a celebrated intellectual who taught at Harvard, Yale, and Columbia. His name is Herbert Marcuse, Marcuse, and he's really is sort of one of the gurus of political correctness among the academic elite that run today's most of today's universities in the United States. And how did he become a celebrated intellectual? Well, he wrote a 1955 book called Eros and Civilization, in which he advised young people the following, and I quote, "Don't work, have sex."
Throw it as hard as you want. Go on. Watching it zip away feels like it might just keep going, right? Nope.
And I guess it never occurred to him that the two things are not mutually exclusive at all. But so it's idiocy like this that makes you a celebrated intellectual at Harvard, I guess. And he also denounced the scientific method in science. He said science and the scientific method are the enemy. He called it, quote, the enemy because, quote, it denies the reality of utopia. And by utopia, he meant communism. He was a communist. He was a self-described communist. And so it denies the reality of communism. Well, it sure does, especially economic science. You know, Mises' great book, Socialism, explained that a long, long time ago. Socialism could never work as an economic system. Okay, he opposed freedom of speech and academic freedom for the same reason, that it produced too many criticisms of communism. And so let's just shut everybody up about this and only give our students positive images of it. And it reminds me, at my university, I created a new course called Capitalism and Its Critics. It was my...
All right. Yeah, so Herbert Marcuse is a very important figure in this movement. And I'm going to link to this article that talks about what he's talking about here. But just know that, yeah, I mean, silencing dissent is a big part of this, right? We can't have capitalism. We can't have freedom of speech or academic freedom, and we can't have the scientific method, right? Because what is the scientific method at its core? I mean, why do we even have a scientific method? What is that all about? Remember, I was talking about what you know, all knowledge, and then what you know, and then what you know that you don't know. Let me give you some examples. Like, for example, I know that I don't know brain surgery, okay? I know that I don't know how to practice law, okay? There's certain things that I know that I don't know. But when you get to the scientific method, you're dealing in the realm of something that you already, you know you don't know. So the question is how do you get access to this? How do you get access to something that you know that you don't know? And the answer to that is you ask questions. Okay? Well, if you don't have academic freedom, okay, if there's no scientific method, that means you can't ask questions. And we saw this during COVID. We saw this where people were saying, oh, you question the science? What are you talking about? The science is settled. And you see this with the climate change question. I wish I had it, but there's a video that I ran across. It was very, very interesting where the guy talks about if anybody ever comes on TV and says, this is a global crisis, well, then you know they're lying, because there's no such thing as a global crisis. There's pockets of crises that happen, right? But there's no global crisis. There's no such thing. And that's just how you know someone's lying to you. I'll see if I can dig the video up sometime and maybe play it on one of the other, maybe on the next one, the next series. But, you know, academic freedom is all about asking questions. And what you got now in these universities is they say that, okay, they say, oh yeah, sure, ask your questions, you know, but the reality is if you write a paper and you say some of the things I'm saying, you're going to get an F, okay? Because that's the way the institution has gone. So there is no real academic freedom anymore. And this is probably why you're going to start to see a decline in the university system. I mean, for one thing, it's gotten terribly expensive, and people can't go to universities anymore and then come out and earn money enough to justify the expense. That's the biggest problem. But then the other problem, well, there's a couple problems. One, it doesn't teach people in mass. It doesn't teach people useful things. It's too expensive. But then there's not a learning process. There's no questioning going on that's challenging people's thinking that allows them to learn how to learn. And this is a big problem in the university system. Now, if you go get an engineering degree or a computer science degree, I mean, all these degrees deal in the realm of reality. Okay, so a computer only works a particular way. No amount of DEI is going to change that. Gravity only exists in a particular way, and no amount of DEI is going to change that. So the physical sciences, things like that, you're still going to have the scientific method and things like that. But in this biology realm, there's a lot of hubris in microbiology and immunology, in these other sciences, these spin-off sciences from pure biology, pure chemistry, things like that. So, and then of course you get into the humanities and forget about it. I mean, you can't hardly learn history the right way. And really the best way to learn history is kind of learn history and economics together, because when you're looking at these events that take place, the only way to really understand them, like why did this happen, is to look at what was happening economically too. We've talked about this when you talk about the American Civil War, which I don't like to call it that. I call it the war of aggression against the South, because really what happened there is the North invaded the South, right? But when you study something like the Civil War, it's all about slavery, it's all about this, it's all about that. Nobody ever teaches you about some of the economic things that were going on. The tariffs between the U.S. and Europe, and the way that the Northern industrialists used the Congress and the lawmaking power to punish the South for not trading with them, preferably over Europe and things like that. So there was a lot of things going on there that really didn't have anything to do with slavery, but that's the history we learn, right? We learned that, it's all about slavery, and Lincoln freed the slaves, and Lincoln was trying to find some place to send the slaves. He wanted to try to put them on ships and send them out of America, okay? He spent a lot of time trying to do that, negotiating with other countries, wasn't able to do it. You don't learn about that in school. And so there's just, when you're getting into the history or humanities, there's just a lot of manipulation there. And the state gets to decide what the kids learn. That's just the reality of it. All right, with that, I think I'm going to wrap up. I've been talking here for about 50 minutes. Thank you guys for coming in. Thanks for listening. Appreciate you indulging me. I think this is really important stuff. I'm trying to kind of give you a trajectory of background on where some of this comes from and why we should really work hard to unlearn it. You first have to unlearn all this stuff before you go learn something new. But I think it's worth the effort. If you've got kids, you got children, the next generation, you're going to have to figure out a way to impart this knowledge to them. You may have to homeschool them, but at the very least, you should get them out of the public school system and put them in some sort of academic rich environment where they can learn from the best, the best scholars. People like, if you're going to learn economics, you want to learn from Tom DiLorenzo, okay? You don't want to learn from Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman is a hack, and he's a Democrat. He's kind of a political hack. He's really more political than he is devoted to economics. And you can tell that when you listen to him talk. To me, it's worth the effort. If America really is going to be great again, it's going to have to start with these principles. We're going to have to come back to these principles. Just like if you were floating around out in space and you wanted to come back to Earth, you're going to have to come back to understanding gravity, okay? Because that's a principle, that's a first principle that you have to understand if you're going to live on planet Earth. And by the same token, if we're going to learn how to be free and learn how to treat each other with respect and integrity and things like that, you have to learn how to be free and how free people treat one another. And how do we get that back to the e pluribus unum, like what it says on our money. From many one. That's what that means. E pluribus unum. From many one. That's a statement of liberty, okay? That's what that is. And the only way to get back to that is to unlearn all this garbage and start to question and start to read and learn some real history. I highly recommend Liberty Classroom by Tom Woods. Another good one now that's out is Scott Horton Academy. This is all about the Cold War, the wars, just all the wars really, and the way the state schemes and manipulates to create war, and why war is the health of the state. So Scott Horton Academy is another great. It's not just Scott Horton talking, okay? There's a lot of people, let's call them trusted academics, people like Tom DiLorenzo, that are scholarly and are teaching these courses. Excuse me. You can listen to them in your car while you're driving around. So I highly recommend that. But do what you can do to first unlearn all the stuff you've learned and begin to, humble yourself and try to understand that you don't know what you don't know. And the only way you're going to do that is going to ask some questions, read some books, and get access to answers that you didn't get in the public school system or even at the university. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks, guys, for coming in. Appreciate you listening. Go visit Who Gets to Decide on YouTube. Give me a thumbs up and a subscribe, and even click the little bell so that when shows come out, you'll know. Comment on the show if you like. Go out and write a review on one of your podcatchers. Any of those things help the show grow, and I would really appreciate if you could do that. And until next time, we'll see you guys a couple of days. We'll see you. I'll have another show for you on Who Gets to Decide. Thanks, everybody. Peace.